Story 1, The House at Hollow Creek. It was a moonless night when I first drove down the old gravel road that everyone in the county tried to forget. The cornfields on either side were tall and dry, rustling like whispers in a church. At the end of the road stood a farmhouse that had been empty since the fire that took a family 20 years earlier. Locals said the place was cursed. They said you could still hear the mother screaming for her children in the wind. I had taken the job because I needed money. The property had been bought by someone from the city who wanted to flip it. My task was to clear out the rubble and salvage what I could. When I stepped through the doorway I could smell charred wood and smoke even after all those years. Inside the front room I found blackened beams and a child's toy, melted but still recognizable. There was a feeling of sorrow and anger that hung in the air, like a heavy fog. In the corner under a fallen beam I found an old book with brittle pages. It was a diary from someone who had lived there. The last entry was a plea for forgiveness and a warning that the land was cursed. They had built over an old burial ground, and the spirits had not forgiven them. On the first night I camped in my truck. That's when the trouble started. At midnight the temperature dropped. My breath came out in white puffs. A soft thumping echoed from inside the house. It sounded like someone was walking through the charred rooms. I told myself it was just the wind. Then a rock hit my door hard enough to dent metal. Another slammed into the bed. I got out and shone my flashlight, but nobody was there. It was as if the house itself was throwing things at me, like an angry poltergeist. The second day I found a small cemetery hidden behind tall weeds near the tree line. Simple stone markers were cracked and covered in moss. One grave was open. An empty hole gaped up at me, with claw marks gouged into the dirt like something had tried to climb out. A rusty sign nearby warned, "Do not disturb the sleep of the damned." I felt a chill run down my back, but I went back to work. Each time I went inside the house I heard whispering. At first it was soft, like two people gossiping in another room. By nightfall the voices were clear. "Leave," they said in a tone that made my teeth ache. "Get out." I tried to leave, but the engine of my truck would not start. All the gauges went crazy. My headlights flickered and died. I was trapped. In the darkness figures appeared between the trees. Black shapes, taller than any man, with eyes like coals. They moved with the wind, gliding towards me without sound. I thought I was seeing things until one of them stepped into my headlights. It was not a shadow cast by someone else. It was a shadow person, a piece of night shaped like a man. It reached out a long arm. When it touched the hood, frost crawled across the metal. I could hear whispering voices even though its mouth did not move. They were telling me to return what had been taken, to put right the wrong that had been done. My mind raced. I remembered the open grave. I ran there, stumbling through the weeds. Inside the hole was a small wooden box, almost turned to powder. A family name was carved on the lid. I picked it up carefully. The air thickened. Behind me I heard footsteps. When I turned, I saw her. A woman with hair like burnt straw, skin gray as ash, eyes burning with hatred. "You left us to burn," she hissed. She was the mother from the fire, the vengeful spirit that had been trapped by the curse. I placed the box on the ground and whispered an apology. The shadow people gathered around, their hands resting gently on the lid. They began to sink into the earth, pulling the box and the woman with them. Her scream was not pain, but relief. When they were gone the night grew warmer. My truck started on the first try. I left and never went back. People still ask me why I quit. I just tell them some places are meant to be left alone. Story 2, The Preacher's Motel. People in our county avoid the stretch of two-lane highway that cuts through the Badlands west of town. It is a lonely road with no lights and nothing but dry fields and scrub stretching for miles. Halfway down is a rundown roadside motel that closed in the early 70s. Locals say a traveling preacher went crazy there one winter and cursed the place. Since then, truckers have reported seeing furniture thrown at them from empty rooms and hearing angry voices when they stop for gas. I decided to spend a night there to see for myself. I parked under the cracked neon sign. The night was cold and the wind whistled through broken windows. Inside the lobby I saw old chairs covered in dust and mildew. The walls were stained with smoke. I picked a room at the far end, propped a chair under the door handle and spread my sleeping bag on the warped floor. I tried to make a joke of it, but my laughter died quickly. I could feel the weight of the place closing in. Around midnight I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if someone were shuffling in worn slippers. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath. There was a loud bang on the door like someone had kicked it with all their strength. Then silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. A few minutes later the room grew colder. My breath hung in the air. Items started moving on their own. The lamp beside me slid across the table and crashed to the floor. A Bible flew off the dresser and slammed into the wall so hard it left an imprint. Drawers opened and closed repeatedly. It was like invisible hands were tearing the room apart. I sat up and shouted for it to stop. But that seemed to anger whatever was there. The bed lifted off the floor and slammed down, splintering the frame. I could hear heavy breathing right next to my ear even though no one was there. This was no gentle haunting. It was a poltergeist, a violent spirit that could move objects. I decided to leave, but the door would not budge. It felt like someone was pushing against it from the other side. I remembered the story of the preacher. He had checked into this very room during a blizzard. He supposedly heard voices telling him to repent. He started throwing furniture around, screaming scripture at empty corners. He burned pages from the good book and cursed God for abandoning him. By morning he was dead. Some say he hanged himself. Others say something pulled him through the window. Either way, the curse began that night. To calm the poltergeist, old folks said, you had to speak to him like a man, not like a monster. I took a deep breath and began to talk. I told him I was sorry for his pain. I said his message was heard. The room shuddered. A heavy mirror lifted itself and smashed against the door, showering glass everywhere. My hands shook but I kept talking. I recited a simple prayer my grandmother taught me when I was little. The chaos slowed. The drawers eased shut. The bed settled. In the corner of the room a dark figure appeared. He was tall and thin. Dressed in a tattered suit, face shadowed. I could see the outline of a rope burn on his neck. His eyes were empty. He stared at me for a long time, then nodded once. A whisper curled around me like smoke. Thank you, it said, broken and rough. Then he faded. Warmth returned. The door opened with a soft creak. I grabbed my bag and ran into the night. As I drove away I looked back in the rearview mirror. All the lights in the motel flickered on at once, even though there was no power. They burned bright for a few seconds, then went dark forever. I do not take lonely roads anymore. Years later, when I tell this story at campfires, people ask if I saw things move. I tell them objects can be replaced. What haunts me is the sound of a man's voice, full of sorrow, thanking me for hearing him. The curse of that old motel was not just broken furniture. It was a soul trapped in anger. And out there in the heartland, on some cold night, you might hear him too if you dare to listen. Story 3, The Lady in White. When I was in my 20s I worked as a night security guard for a large grain elevator complex in the middle of Kansas. The place sat by itself on an endless plain. At night the only lights were the blinking red towers and the stars. My job was to walk the perimeter every hour and make sure the silos were secure. It was boring work until the night I met the lady in white, it was late September, harvest time. The farmers had been bringing loads of grain all day. Around midnight a storm rolled in. Lightning flashed over the horizon, but the rain never came. The air smelled like ozone and dust. I started my rounds. On the south side of the property there was a small hill with a stand of old trees. At the base of one tree I noticed something I had never seen before, a small marble headstone half sunk into the ground. The name and dates were worn away, but beneath them were the words, "She waits." I touched the stone and felt a jolt run up my arm. I shrugged it off and kept walking. As I turned back towards the main office I heard someone crying. It was a woman's sob, low and broken, carried on the wind. I aimed my flashlight at the tree line. In the white beam stood a figure dressed in a long gown. Her hair was matted and hanging over her face. Her hands were clenched in fists. She swayed from side to side like she was in pain. I called out to see if she needed help. She lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were empty holes and her mouth was twisted in a grimace of rage. "You will pay," she whispered, though her lips did not move. In an instant she was right in front of me. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on my breath. I stumbled back and fell. She was so close I could see the texture of her skin. It looked like wet paper, translucent and thin, stretched over bone. Dark veins pulsed beneath the surface. In her hand she clutched a piece of rope. I realized I was looking at a spirit that had been hanged. The legend came back to me in flashes. Decades ago locals accused a young woman of setting fire to the grain silo. Without trial they dragged her to that very tree and lynched her. Later they discovered the fire had been started by lightning. Her name was erased from the records, her family driven away. Some said she cursed the land. Others said she simply waited for justice. The lady in white leaned down until her face was inches from mine. I could feel the electric charge of her anger. She opened her hand and pressed the rope into my chest. I thought she was attacking me, but she was showing me. In my mind I saw the night she died. The mob tying the rope around her neck. The men spitting on her as they kicked the barrel out from under her feet. Her last sight was the elevator towers, lights blinking like indifferent eyes. Her last thought was of the child she would never hold. The vision ended with the sound of her neck snapping. I gasped and sat up. "You will not be forgotten," I said, tears running down my face. I apologized for what had been done to her. I promised to put her stone upright and speak her name. The anger in her eyes softened. She straightened and stepped back. For the first time I noticed the shape of others behind her, faint forms of people watching from the shadows of the trees. They were the men from the mob. They watched her go with hollow eyes. As she faded, they stayed. Their punishment was to stand vigil over the land they had wronged. Sometimes when I pass that hill at night I still see them, dark figures with no faces. The lady in white never returns. I think she finally found the justice she was denied. After that night I contacted the county records office. We found a name that matched the time and place. Her name was Mary Ellerby. We cleaned her grave and erected a proper marker. We told her story at the town meeting. Some men left the room with their heads hung low. In the heartland people believe in forgiveness, but they also know curses have a way of sticking around until someone sets them right. Story 4, Black Hollow. My cousins and I grew up in a small town in Nebraska. On autumn nights we would drive farm roads and tell scary stories. The one that spooked us most was about Black Hollow, a stand of trees 10 miles out of town. Farmers said shadow people lived there, tall dark figures that watched anyone who entered. At 17 we thought we were brave. We decided to see if the story was true. The older folks in town told us never to set foot in that grove after dark. One farmer swore he found his cows standing in a circle there at dawn, their eyes glazed, their hides covered in frost. Another man said he saw shadow people carrying lanterns through his field, lighting no flame, just darkness deeper than dark. There were also rumors about a small cemetery hidden among the trees where pioneers buried their dead. They said the ground there was cursed because someone built over the graves. We rolled our eyes at those stories and took them as a challenge. We left at dusk. The gravel road was empty. When we reached Black Hollow, we killed the engine and climbed over a fence with a sign that warned us to stay away. Inside the grove the air felt heavier. The smell of damp earth and rot filled our noses. Our flashlights seemed weak, as if the darkness absorbed their beams. As we made our way deeper, one of us tripped over a low stone. I scraped away the leaves and uncovered part of a headstone. The dates were worn to nothing, but you could tell someone had been buried there long ago. The idea that we were walking over graves made my stomach twist. Maybe the shadow people were not demons at all, but guardians of those forgotten dead. The thought made the hair on my arms stand up. After a few minutes I saw movement to my left. I turned my light and saw a figure between two trees. It was taller than a man and thin, as if carved from shadow. No light reflected off it, yet I felt it staring at me. More shapes appeared around us, flickering like smoke. We shouted and backed up. They matched our movements. One reached out and touched my cousin Sam. He screamed and fell. Where it touched him his skin turned white and cold, whispering filled the air. We could not understand the words, but they pressed against our minds. Our flashlights flickered and went out. We were in total darkness, surrounded by something we couldn't fight. I remembered what an old farmer had told us: the shadow people guard places where the boundary between life and death is thin. If you trespass, you must show respect. We dropped to our knees and spoke apologies. We said we meant no harm and would leave. The whispering rose, then died away. A wind blew through the grove. When it stopped, the shapes were gone. Sam's skin slowly warmed. We ran back to the truck without looking back. Back in town we were quiet. Sam didn't talk for days. We kept his secret because we didn't want people to think we had gone crazy. But soon after, strange things began to happen. At night we would hear footsteps outside our windows, slow and scraping. When we turned on the porch light, nothing was there. Sam's frostbite mark never really went away. On cold mornings you can still see the faint outline of a handprint on his shoulder. Sometimes when he walks by a mirror he sees a tall dark figure standing behind him. He says it doesn't scare him anymore. He says it's just watching. Years later I drive past the road to Black Hollow with my own children. I tell them not to go there. I do not tell them why. Maybe some stories are warnings, not entertainment. Out on the prairie, with only the stars and the wind and the endless fields, there are things older than us that still watch over the land. If you respect them, they will let you pass. If you trespass, they will not forgive easily. There are places in the heartland where the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond is thin. Sometimes that veil is guarded by beings that do not like to be seen. If you feel the air grow heavy or sense figures that shouldn't be there, trust your instincts and leave. Curiosity is not worth the price of carrying a mark you cannot see. Story 5, Forgotten Stones. In the far corner of our county, down a dirt track that few people travel, sits a cluster of stone markers lost in tall grass. They belong to an old pioneer cemetery that was abandoned when the railroad came through and the town moved. When I was a kid my grandfather would point toward those hills and warn me. "Those bones have been forgotten," he said. "Disturb them and you'll wake what sleeps there." Folklore in town said the graves belonged to settlers who had died in winter, their wagons stuck in the mud. They had no family to tend their markers, so the prairie swallowed them. Those who dared cut across the cemetery at night told of cold hands brushing their arms and whispers asking for names. I always thought he was telling tall tales until I met the man who did just that. his name was Carl. He was a retired mechanic from the city who bought 40 acres next to the cemetery. He wanted a quiet place to hunt and build a cabin. The land was cheap because no one else wanted it. He cleared trees and poured a foundation right up to the edge of the graveyard. He brushed aside the warnings, thinking old stories were just superstition. He told us he liked the view of the stones. On his first night he invited a couple of us over. The stones looked like jagged teeth in the fading light. I felt uneasy and left early. That night a storm rolled in. Wind howled and something pounded on the cabin walls like angry fists. Tools fell off hooks. Dishes slid off shelves and shattered. A rocking chair moved on its own. When Carl tried to turn on a light, the bulb exploded. Voices whispered outside. He looked through the window and saw dark figures moving among the graves. They were like shadows made of smoke. One turned toward him. Its eyes glowed red and it raised an arm and pointed. He realized he had built on land that was not his. The next day he went into town to ask about the graveyard. He learned most of the families buried there had died of fever and had no descendants. The town never moved their bodies. Over time the fences fell, stones were knocked over and cows wandered through. People whispered that those buried there were angry. That anyone who disrespected them would be cursed. Carl tried to shrug it off, but the nights got worse. He woke with scratches on his arms and bruises around his ankles. Doors slammed. Heavy footsteps paced over his head even though the cabin had no second floor. The air smelled like rot. He called me and asked what to do. I told him to fix what he had broken. We spent the next day setting stones upright and clearing brush. We read the names on each marker out loud. We built a fence and left flowers. Carl apologized to whatever was listening. That night was quiet. No banging, no voices. We thought it was done. Then around 3 in the morning Carl woke with weight on his chest. A woman leaned over him. Her face was pale and her eyes were dark hollows. Her mouth opened wider than possible and she screamed without sound. Behind her stood several shadowy figures watching. Carl understood that some of the dead had forgiven him, but one had not. The next day we found an unmarked grave at the edge of the cemetery. The ground above it looked disturbed. We dug and uncovered a small wooden box. Inside were the bones of a child and a rusted doll. No stone had ever been placed there. Maybe the family was too poor. Carl carved beloved child into a new marker and placed it above the grave. He set the box back into the earth with care. That night the cabin stayed still. The air smelled like rain. A weight lifted from the place. Carl stayed on that land for years without another incident. He always kept flowers on that child's grave. If you ever find yourself tempted to build near an abandoned cemetery, remember this story. The heartland is full of forgotten resting places. Curses are not always loud. Sometimes they are the quiet anger of those left behind. Show respect and you might hear nothing but the wind. Disrespect them and you will learn that stones can speak and shadows can reach through walls.